We covered rendering in some detail before, but I want to dive back into it to cover a few more things. So in this video I'm going to be using our barrel 3D model from the beginner tutorial series. So let's start with render engines. There are 3 different render engines inside of Blender: Eevee, Workbench and Cycles. Workbench is used for fast rendering whilst you are doing your 3D modelling. You do not use Workbench for final renders, it is simply there to help you visualise the basics of your render scene as you work on it. Eevee is a real-time render engine. What this means is that it shows us our rendered scene at all times whilst we are in rendered preview. Cycles is a physically based path tracer, which gives good rendering results. However, it is not real-time, which means if we were in render preview, you can see that it has to recalculate everything as we move our camera in the 3D viewport. So based on that, you would think, what's the point of Cycles and Workbench if we can just use Eevee to get good real-time rendering results? Well, there is a large difference, and we're going to get a bit technical here, but Eevee is focused on being a fast render engine. Because of this, it has to compromise itself to an extent. Eevee computes the lighting using a technique called rasterization. If you want to read up further on that, I will leave a link in the description. Cycles, on the other hand, is slower to render things, but it computes lighting by calculating each ray of light in the scene. So in summary, Cycles is slower, but will always provide the best results. Eevee and Workbench are good render engines for checking things out as you build your scenes, but Cycles is better used as the final render. Now that we have discussed the different render engines in Blender, let's go into 2 of the main rendering properties windows: Render Properties and Output Properties. So the Render Properties window controls all of the main parts of rendering in Blender. Sampling is something that is used across all 3 rendering engines, and it's probably the most important part of rendering. When you are doing a render, Blender will send out a number of rays from the camera position, which will hit all of the objects in that scene. When the ray hits the object, it will do a lot of calculations to try and render the image as best as it can. This process is called sampling. So you can choose how many samples you want the render engine to use when rendering your scene. More samples equals a crisper and better looking render. Just be careful when increasing your samples, as it becomes a lot for the computer to handle, especially if you do not have a powerful computer. The render field just means how many samples you want when you actually perform a render, and the viewport field here is for how many samples you want when you are in the render preview mode. The output properties gives us the options to change the output of our render. You can change the resolution of the image or the aspect ratio. So that covers a lot of the main elements on rendering in Blender for our intermediate tutorial series. There is a lot more to rendering, especially in Blender, but I will probably cover that on another video. We know everything we need to know about rendering for now. In the next video, we are going to go over some more useful tips and tricks before we dive into our intermediate series project.